Well, hey everybody, welcome back to class. And this is the mini lecture for Module 2, Drugs as a Social Problem. I want to welcome you back to class and say again, I hope that you're doing well. Hope that you are finding your way around the classroom and navigating everything okay, and that you're kind of getting settled in for the semester. We are already up to now our second or third week, kind of rolling along, and we have one more module. This second module, module number 2, is really kind of our last module of introduction before we get into module 3 and start talking about the specific drug classes and classification and families. That's kind of what this class is about. So we're going to start talking about the stimulants next week with module number 3. But this second module is just another kind of introduction, foundational kind of a module for us in this class. I want to encourage you again to just remember that these little videos at the front of every single module really are just intended to be a summary of the lecture notes that I provided for you, and also to what is in the textbook reading for the week. So chapter 2 is our textbook reading for this module. And what I'm going to do in just the next few minutes or so is just try to kind of summarize for you and highlight just some key ideas related to this module. And I'll do that with every single module as a way to kind of give you not just something written in black and white, but also to a little verbal mini lecture, visual mini lecture as well too. So make sure that you're not just watching just this video, but go through, read the lecture notes, look at the textbook as you do your discussion question and your homework. So this module is titled Drugs or Substances as a Social Problem. So let me just start by saying something kind of obvious. Not everyone in this class, but my hunch is that many of you in this class are interested in one day working as a substance abuse counselor or an LCDC or something like that. And that is an awesome profession to pursue. It's an awesome desire. Many of you I know have a heart and a passion for working with people who struggle with drug and alcohol problems. And I just want to kind of state something obvious. There's a reason why we need substance abuse counselors. It's because people struggle often with substance abuse. That's kind of obvious, right? But we live in a world today, and we know the obvious, and it's this. Even though we talked last week about how generally at its foundation, a lot of the substances we're going to talk about in this class are neutral, we know the reality. The reality is that people struggle with substances, with drugs and alcohol and other substances. They struggle with abusing them. They struggle with being addicted or dependent upon them. And that is just a reality. Many of the substances that we're going to cover in this class are called substances of abuse, which means they have the potential for people to use them in ways that are harmful to themselves or to others. And so that's kind of what this little lecture, this little module is, just to kind of highlight sort of probably some obvious things for most of us. And it's just this. Although not everyone who uses a substance creates an abusive relationship or develops an abusive relationship with that relationship or becomes addicted to that substance, not every single person who uses a substance struggles with abuse or dependence, but many do. And there is the potential for that to happen. That's why many of you want to be LCDs and drug and alcohol counselors, is because we all know the reality. The reality is that drugs and alcohol can and do create problems. Who do they create problems for? Let me ask you that question. So who do who do drugs and alcohol create problems for? Well, they obviously create problems for the person using the substance. Is that the only person? Nope, you know that. Their family members, for example. Many of you in the class, like I do, maybe you have people in your family. If you've never struggled with addiction, you know someone who has or does. I do in my own family, in my own small circle. I have people who I'm related to, who I know, who I care about, who either currently today are struggling with addiction or they previously have struggled with addiction. And as a friend or family member of theirs, their addiction, their struggle with drug and alcohol abuse or addiction affects me in all kinds of ways, right? Chapter 5, 6, and 7 in your textbook, we're going to look at those chapters a little bit later this semester, are really, really good related to the family. The author of our textbook takes 3 whole chapters and devotes 3 whole chapters to the family and addiction. And so if you want to read ahead a little bit, and if you're interested in drug and alcohol counseling, especially your family systems, take a look at those 3 chapters. Excellent, excellent chapters. We're going to look at them a little bit later this semester. But Substance abuse, drug and alcohol problems create problems for the individual. They create problems for family members and friends. They also create problems for society as a whole. You and I don't have to know a person who struggles with drug addiction to be negatively affected by that. There was a story in the news not long ago, not far from my house actually, of a an accident that happened in the evening time about sunset, where a woman who was impaired was driving down the wrong side of the road, and she hit two cars. Luckily, did not kill anyone. She was not killed. She was injured seriously, and she seriously injured other people, including two children. Those people who were affected, they were just driving down the road, minding their own business. They were not impaired. They don't know this lady, but because of her impairment on whatever substance she was on, now their lives have been touched, in this case by impaired driving. And so society as a whole is impacted potentially negatively by drugs and alcohol. So drugs and alcohol have the potential to create problems for us. Does that mean it's always true? Not always, but it has the potential to do that. So that's kind of what this module is about. Not to be overly negative, but we're just sort of highlighting, kind of a reality or two that I just want you to be aware of as we go forward into this class. It's why many of you are in this class. It's why many of you are studying to be drug and alcohol counselors, because you want to help people. You're not trying to put people down. You want to help people who are struggling, and people can and do struggle with substances. So just real quickly, just to kind of give you a little quick overview of this module, I give you some information in this module about the government's role when it comes to substances, because substances, many of the substances that we'll talk about in our class have the potential for addiction or the potential to be substances of abuse. It's always important to keep in mind that the federal, local, and state governments of our land oftentimes are involved in monitoring and regulating, especially certain substances. And that's always just important to kind of just keep in the context of our conversation, realizing that we kind of live in a world where, part of the government's role, whether it's local or state or federal, part of the government's role is to protect us from one another and protect us from ourselves. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes. So the government oftentimes is involved when it comes to substances. Some of the substances we'll talk about this in this class are illegal. The federal government has determined, or the state government has determined, that certain substances are illegal. Some substances are illegal for a certain age. So, for example, alcohol and tobacco are not illegal if you're over a certain age, but they are illegal to possess or to use or to sell if you're under a certain age, right? So the government gets involved in that way as far as monitoring and managing the way in which certain substances are involved. We talked a little bit about that on one of the pages in our lecture notes. We talk about how one of the reasons why the government gets involved with substances is because of crime. Now, does crime always go with drugs and alcohol? Not always, but often, very often do we see, number one, men and women and teenagers too, who have drug and alcohol problems. Many of them have legal problems as a direct result of those drug and alcohol problems. So we know that drugs and crime go together for that reason. We also know too that drugs and the selling of illicit drugs especially is big business. And so because they're illicit, it's illegal to sell them. So there's money involved. So the government gets involved to monitor the selling of, the transporting of, the dealing of illicit substances. And so people oftentimes get in trouble that way. So drugs and crime often go together. We know that many people, I've had many clients through the years, I've had many students through the years who were in trouble with the law. They had criminal histories or criminal records, or they were on parole or probation. And once I heard their story, I realized, as often happens, that part of how they got in trouble with the law was because of their substance use or their addiction. Maybe they were impaired and they were operating machinery or driving. Maybe they were impaired and they beat up someone or they got into a physical altercation. Maybe because of their addiction, they engaged in criminal behavior like stealing or robbery or whatever as a way to fund their substances and their addiction. So we know that crime and legal issues and drugs and alcohol often run together. Not always, but often. I mentioned that a little bit in this module. And at the very end of the module, there's three things I wanted to summarize for you really, really quickly that I mentioned last week in module number one. So in module number one, you may remember we talked about the drug use continuum, and there were four pieces on that continuum, right? Substance use, substance misuse, substance abuse, and substance dependence. So the very first one, substance use, is just substance use. That's where someone is, for example, drinking alcohol, and they're doing it legally, responsibly, appropriately. They're not drinking to the point to where it impairs them or puts other people at danger. Substance use. But substance use often evolves into substance misuse. And that's when my substance use begins to create problems for me or other people. And substance misuse then often evolves into substance abuse. And substance abuse often evolves into substance dependence or addiction. So the word dependence and the word addiction are in this context are the same thing. Substance use, misuse, abuse, and dependence slash addiction. So those last three, misuse, abuse, and dependence or addiction, are examples of terms that we use to refer to situations where people are struggling and having problems with their substance use. So what I give to you at the end of this module is I give to you some more information and a little clear definition on the last two, substance abuse and substance addiction. We often use those terms interchangeably. But technically, those are two separate terms. Someone can abuse alcohol but not be dependent on it. Someone can abuse cocaine and not be addicted to cocaine, potentially, right? So, substance abuse and substance dependence are two separate terms that really are defined by at what level does the substance use create problems for the person. Substance dependence or addiction is the more severe of the two. But usually, even with substance abuse, that's when basically my substance use is now creating problems for me, consistent, chronic problems for me, legal problems, school problems, financial problems, relationship problems. There's a pattern now. There is emerging a consistent pattern of abuse, use or abuse that now is creating problems for me. And people sometimes can struggle with substance abuse and never become dependent upon a substance. But if substance abuse goes on long enough, eventually it usually crosses a line to substance dependence or addiction. And I give you some information in the module this week about, well, what is addiction? And there's a lot of different ways that we can look at addiction, actually. If you've been in different classes with different professors in our programs, or if you're active in the recovery community, you know that there's actually several definitions out there around addiction. So I kind of just give you a couple of examples of when we say someone is dependent upon a substance, whatever it is. In other words, they're addicted to it. What does that mean? Well, tolerance is usually involved, withdrawal is usually involved. Their substance use has become compulsive. They feel driven, like they have to do it. They cannot live without it. There's a lack of control. There's expanded negative consequences. Sometimes people will say, well, someone is dependent on a substance when they begin to build their life around their substance use. Yes, I would accept that. And so I give you 5 or 6 little, I won't call them symptoms, but kind of signs that help us to determine when someone's substance abuse becomes substance dependence or addiction. So there's a whole long conversation we could have about just that whole idea. Some of you know from your pharmacology class, for example, I'll mention this. There are certain substances where the movement from substance use to addiction is usually very fast. So nicotine and cocaine and heroin are 3 examples. If I begin to smoke cigarettes, substance use, consistently, it will only be just a few days before my body is craving more nicotine. So people can go from smoking cigarettes, just smoking the occasional cigarette, to being addicted to nicotine in just a matter of days. That's not uncommon. Cocaine, for example, opioids like heroin, for example, it's not uncommon at all for people to go from experimentation or use to physical, psychological dependence in a matter of just days. Now, other substances can be slower. For example, marijuana could be an example of that. Alcohol could be an example of that in some people, right? So sometimes the progression from substance use to misuse to abuse to dependence is sometimes more gradual or progressive. Sometimes people may abuse a substance and never move into addiction. We see that sometimes too, right? So one of the things, again, some of this is old information to some of you, but I give you some information in this module about those 2 old core ideas, substance abuse and substance dependence. Those are 2 separate things. They're related to each other. And it highlights this idea that we believe when someone struggles with addiction, it is what we call a progressive disease or disorder. It doesn't just happen like that. Usually it is a progressive. Now, sometimes the progression is very quick, but addiction is a progressive, and even substance abuse is a progressive kind of a struggle. So go and look in the notes and look at just the basic definitions of substance abuse and dependence. I also provide for you just 3 or 4 bullets around this idea. Speaking of substance addiction or dependence, through the years, I've had lots of clients say to me, Glenn, it's kind of funny. I drink, but I could stop drinking tomorrow. My brother, I mean, he cannot not drink. He's an alcoholic. I'm not an alcoholic. I drink sometimes, but I don't need it to survive. And there are times when I go months, days, years and not drink. My brother can't even get through a day without drinking. Why is it that he's an alcoholic and I'm not, right? Or why is it my son, for example, I believe personally that marijuana can be addictive in certain individuals. Well, why can some people become dependent upon marijuana and others don't? So I give you 3 or 4 bullets on a page. I think it's called something about just the puzzle of addiction, and that there oftentimes are a number of factors that come into play that sometimes help us to understand why one person may become addicted or dependent upon a substance, but another person does not, and just some of the factors that come into play when it comes to addiction. And so go look for that as well too. And then the last thing I give to you is this. Again, if you are in the room and you are interested, especially in drug and alcohol counseling, you need to be familiar with this term. It is the term substance use disorder. Substance use disorder. That is a new term. It has only been around since 2013, when the DSM-5, the most recent version of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, was published by the American Psychiatric Association. And in the new DSM-5, the APA has given us kind of a new way of looking at substance abuse problems, a new way of assessing and diagnosing, so to speak, substance abuse problems. And it basically has given us this broad term called substance use disorders. Sometimes we just refer to it as SUDS, S-U-D-S, right? It's probably not a very good acronym, but the SUDS, right? Substance use disorders. And there are 11 potential symptoms or signs of a substance use disorder. And I give you that information as well in this module out of the DSM-5. And so in the DSM-5, the DSM does not worry about addiction or dependence or abuse. It takes more of a broad, holistic approach to substance use. And what it says is this: if people have a drug and alcohol problem, it can look a lot of different ways, but it gives us 11. Now, you don't have to memorize all 11, but I want you to go through and get really familiar with what are those 11 signs or symptoms. For example, the substance is taken in larger amounts or over a larger period of time or a longer period of time than was originally intended. So as you're talking to a person and doing an evaluation, as you're working with them, if you realize that as time has gone forward, they've used more and more and more, their substance use and experimentation is growing over time. Well, that's a sign that we sort of are concerned about. Recurrent use that results in failure to fulfill major role obligations in school, work, or home. So has someone's substance use become to the point to where, as a result of their substance use, are they falling down on the job, so to speak? Are they falling down in schoolwork and caring for their kids and going to work or whatever? They've continued to use in spite of the fact that because of their use, they have all these problems. Recurrent use in situations in which it is physically hazardous is another one of the 11. So as we're listening and talking to people about their substance use, we would want to listen for, hey, does this person use substances in a way to where it puts themselves or other people in danger? If the answer is yes, well, then we're worried, right? That's just one of 11, right? Continued use despite knowledge that the substances creates physical problems for me or psychological problems for me, makes my depression worse, makes my anxiety worse, maybe I have a physical condition or a physical problem, and I realize my doctor has told me I need to stop smoking, but yet I keep smoking. My doctor has told me that I'm developing lung problems as a result of my smoking, but yet I keep smoking. So that would be one. So if someone continues to use, even though they know I shouldn't be doing this, well, that is something that sort of gets our attention, right? So those are just 3 or 4 of the 11. I want you to go and get, number 1, familiar with the term substance use disorder. because that is an important term to grab onto. And then I want you to look at the handout I provided for you. I want you just to look at just the different 11 symptoms. If you and I were working out there today as a drug and alcohol counselor, those would be the kinds of things we would kind of listen for. If we were doing like an evaluation, someone comes in, we're working in a drug and alcohol rehab facility, a hospital, outreach, wherever it is we're working, and we're doing an assessment. Well, what are you going to assess? Well, I'm going to assess what kind of substances the person is using. That's correct. I'm also going to assess how long have they been using that substance. Absolutely. But you're also going to assess why do they use it and how has it begun to affect and impact their lives? And those 11 symptoms of a substance use disorder give us some good handles to kind of grab onto. So it's a great little assessment list that I want you to be familiar with. It kind of fits with the conversation we just had about abuse and dependence, right? Because it's very, very similar to that. But the DSM takes a little bit of a broader kind of an approach. And it just uses the term substance use disorder to refer to a person with a drug and alcohol problem. So there you go. Just a little overview of module number 2. Look at chapter 2 in your textbook. If you want to also look at chapters 5, 6, and 7 in your textbook that highlight the family issues, that would also be good. Go through, look at the lecture notes, do your discussion question, do your homework, come back next week, and we'll talk about the stimulants. See you next time. Bye-bye.